Stark is a Portland-based eco-landscape designer, habitat consultant, author, and photographer whose academic background includes biology, wildlife ecology, and design. As a deeply committed conservationist, she strives to create awareness of the myriad creatures with which we share this fragile planet. Her book, Real Gardens Grow Natives: Design, Plant, and Enjoy a Healthy Northwest Garden, is a passionate guide to gardening for both biodiversity and beauty west of the Cascades, using humane landscaping practices and methods. Eileen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and everyone else for tuning in and for your interest. I'm going to talk briefly about why we need to help support pollinators at home, and then talk about their needs and how we can help them in our yards and other landscapes. Healthy ecosystems are very complex natural systems, and plants and animals are essentially the rivets that hold them together. Pollinators are considered keystone species because they have such a large effect on their ecosystem relative to their sizes and numbers. Biodiversity, as you probably know, is essential, and we're in the midst of an extinction crisis. In the past 40 years, the number of wild animals has dropped on average by about half. Scientists predict that in just a couple of decades, 1 million plant and animal species will become extinct, even some that were once common. Insects are considered the most important animals on Earth. They're critical to ecosystems because they're at the base of food webs. And even though they account for about 70% of all animal species on the planet, they've declined by about 45% from pre-industrial times. And it's predicted that about 40% of what's left could go extinct in just the next few decades due to severe habitat loss and fragmentation, pesticides, pollution, climate chaos. Those that are suffering the most dramatic declines are butterflies and moths, beetles, bees, and their relatives, and aquatic insects. There are around 4,000 bee species in North America, leafcutter bees, mason bees, carpenter bees, sweat bees, bumblebees, and others, and they're all dwindling due to habitat loss, pesticides, climate change, as well as competition and disease from managed bees. As much as a third of North American bumblebees are now facing some degree of risk of extinction. Other pollinators come in all shapes and sizes. A lot of flies, ants, wasps, beetles, birds, and even rodents like mice are capable of pollination. Hummingbirds are wonderful pollinators, and with their rapid metabolisms, they need to eat a lot. And each bird can visit hundreds of flowers a day. Although they like to feed at colorful, long, tubular flowers, like this penstemon, they'll feed on a variety of flowers that produce a lot of nectar. And hummingbirds also need a lot of insects in their diet, which they nab from the air or from spider webs or sapwells and leaves and bark. In your area, you might see Anna's hummingbirds, which used to migrate south in the winter, but since the 1930s live here year-round. And possibly rufous hummingbirds, which have the longest migration of any hummingbird, as long as 4,000 miles from Alaska to Mexico. Unfortunately, the rufous is in fairly steep decline. They like to nest in or near forests with willow shrubs, since they use the fluff from willow catkins to line their nests, as well as other soft things like fur. A lot of flies are also strong pollinators. The little hover flies or syrphid flies that you see here are also dwindling. Although little is known about fly pollination, researchers have found that they're as good at pollinating it as bees are. They're usually out earlier in the spring than most bees are, and a lot of them in their larval stage eat pests like aphids and scale insects. Studies have shown that wasps are one of the most hated insects, but they're also great pollinators, and in some cases even step in and pollinate plants when bees aren't around. They also help ecosystems function by controlling unwanted insects and helping with decomposition. And there are wasps known as pollen wasps in the genus Pseudomosarius that feed their larvae only pollen and nectar, very much like solitary bees do. The one you see here is a penstemon specialist and even visits flowers of rare and endangered plants. So they have a really important role in maintaining diversity. Um, they do look a lot like yellow jackets, but are very, very unlikely to sting. They're in flight in Oregon from April through July. In addition to needing pollen and nectar, these wasps also need a source of soil and protected spots for building their mud nests. Beetles go way back, about 200 million years, long before bees and butterflies appeared. They have a very strong sense of smell, so are attracted to plants with heavily scented flowers that are often large and cup-like, that are typically open during the day. But they also use plants that produce clusters of smaller flowers like goldenrod, spirea, yarrow, and milkweed and sunflower. They also eat insects like aphids. Their main threats are habitat destruction, chemical pollutants, introduced species, and hybridization with other species due to human interference. There are roughly 12,000 species of moths and 800 species of butterflies in North America, and their populations are also in trouble. In the US alone, 5 butterflies have gone extinct since 1950, and about 20% are currently at risk of extinction. You may have heard about the 3 that are at risk in our area, the Taylor's checker spot, the Martin skipper, and the Oregon silver spot. Like most animals, pollinators need a lot of things, and it varies with the seasons. As adults, butterflies and moths need nectar plants and other nutrients. They need structure and shelter where they can hibernate or take cover during bad weather. And they need to live without pesticides and light pollution, especially moths. They also need host plants where they can lay their eggs and where their caterpillars can feed. Over 90% of caterpillars eat only native plants, and about 70% are known as specialists. Their young can develop on just one plant family or one plant species. Native plants are best. Studies have found that they're about 4 times more attractive to pollinators in general than introduced plants because they're superior nutritionally and they're what they evolved with. Non-natives often don't provide enough nectar or pollen, and butterfly or moth caterpillars may not be able to feed on them. The Oregon silver spot is a type of fritillary that once lived in the coastal grasslands of Washington and Oregon, and she's very much a specialist. Her caterpillars can only feed on the native Viola adunca or early blue violet. So essentially, though, native plants are the foundation of the food web. They're nature's way of getting the sun's energy into animals, either directly by eating some of the plant, like these little caterpillars, or indirectly by eating the insect that fed on the plant, or the predator that fed on that insect, and so on up the food chain. These relationships aren't coincidences. Insects adapted over many thousands of years to eat certain plants that produce chemicals that attract them. Without them, they can't survive, and published studies reinforce the fact that the widespread displacement of native plant communities by non-native plants is a major cause of insect declines, as well as wildlife further up the food chain. Um, Non-native plants don't support most native insects, either the specialists that can only feed on very few plants, or the generalist insects that are able to use a lot of different plants. Studies show that native plants support about 15 times more wildlife species than non-native plants do. So if you see little holes in the leaves of native plants, that's good. It means the ecosystem and its food webs are working. And you might even start seeing more butterflies and moths and birds, which is another reason to create healthy, diverse landscapes. Um, Nearly all North American land birds feed their young insects or other invertebrates, not seeds or fruit. And native plants provide drastically more insects than non-natives do. Little chickadee parents need as much as 8,000 caterpillars or other insects to feed their young when they're in the nest, and more after they leave the nest. Of course, our gardens are a perfect substitute for unfragmented acres of native ecosystems, but everyone's property, no matter the size, can contribute some benefits, especially when they connect with those next door and down the street. They can contribute to interconnected networks, also known as green corridors. Every little bit helps, and they don't end up being any less for us because helping nature thrive can be very fulfilling and beautiful and liberating because growing natives usually requires a lot less work than non-natives when they're properly placed and established. Also, because they're adapted to a local region, they tend to resist damage from freezing and diseases, and they're sometimes drought tolerant. So our challenge as gardeners now is to go beyond the traditional landscaping standard and take on a new role that goes beyond just our needs and helps to mitigate our ecological crises. But how do we do it? How do we incorporate all the natural advantages of a space so it's not only beautiful, but also functional? Well, the best pollinator landscapes include both host plants for butterflies and moth caterpillars to feed on, and nectar plants for other pollinators, and a few other things that are fairly easy to provide. Um, you know why host plants are so important, so I'll talk a little bit about other food. Both native and non-native plants attract pollinators with their nectar, but as I mentioned, native plants, especially those that occur naturally in an area, local natives, should always be the first choice since they provide countless benefits to other wildlife. And some nectar plants are also host plants. The flowers that a pollinator prefers depends on whether they evolve together, but also the pollinator's size and the length of their tongue or proboscis. Um, since there's such a diversity of pollinators, it's best to provide a variety of nectar plants, trees, shrubs, perennials, and animals if you have the space from spring until fall that vary in size and shape and color to attract a lot of different pollinators. Um, Early spring nectar is especially important for early emerging queen bumblebees and solitary bees, as well as flies and beetles. It's best to arrange smaller plants in masses or groups of at least three of a kind rather than just singly here and there so that they're easy to find. Many moths and butterflies are attracted to rotting fruit, plant sap, even dead animals and scat that offer minerals, fats, and amino acids. Male butterflies are often seen at mud puddles or at the edge of ponds or streams where they find salts and other minerals in the liquid, which they transfer to the female during mating, which helps to increase the viability of her eggs. It's also essential to offer a safe shelter, especially places for them to hibernate in winter, either as eggs, larvae, chrysalis, or adults. In nature, pollinators overwinter in natural shelters like tree cavities or under loose bark, rocks, logs, or leaves. So it's important to leave places like that undisturbed from fall until spring. If you don't have much habitat in your yard, you can add piles of smooth rocks, brush or log piles, old stems, dead wood, and other plant debris to help them hide from predators and find cover. Leaves, as I mentioned, are there for good reasons. They're there to protect the soil and the roots of plants, prevent erosion, and over time they decompose and feed the soil and the creatures necessary for the decay. Leaves are also essential habitat for insects that overwinter in the leaf layer, like queen bumblebees and some butterflies and moths. And beetles often lay their eggs in the soil or under loose leaf litter. It's fine to rake up leaves off hardscape and lawn, but leaving whole leaves on the soil allows the garden to become much more self-sufficient and provide for a huge variety of wildlife. One of the easiest ways to make your garden better for pollinators is to just be more lazy and less neat. A third of native bees are cavity nesters. They use hollow or pithy stems from the previous year's growth, like this little carpenter bee on the left, as well as tunnels and wood made by insects like beetles or woodpeckers and natural cavities in dead wood and brush piles. To help cavity nesters, it's best to just leave dead flower stalks through the winter. And then in springtime, if they're still standing, cut them back to varying heights of about 8 inches to 24 inches, and then leave them until the following spring. So adults can also hibernate in them if they haven't been used. So I mentioned light pollution earlier, and it is a major disturbance. It disrupts ecosystems, biological rhythms, and health, wastes energy, steals the beauty and wonder of the nighttime sky, and contributes to climate change. It's getting worse every year and has awful effects on wildlife species that need uninterrupted darkness or for communication, feeding, um, reproduction, orientation, and sleep. It's terrible for migratory birds who travel at night, and it's very harmful to moths that evolve to have really good low light vision so that they can fly at dusk or nighttime beneath only moonlight or starlight. Too much light usually causes them to spend less time feeding and pollinating. They become confused and disoriented and fly in circles around lights, which can lead to deaths from exhaustion or predation since they're much more obvious in artificial light. Also, many insects use day length to synchronize their life cycle with the changing of the seasons. So, for example, shortening summer days indicate the switch to autumn and triggers the transition to the overwintering state. But a recent study in Europe found that light pollution can cause caterpillars to interpret the day length incorrectly, which leads to the chrysalis developing into an adult moth too early. And so those moths can't successfully reproduce in autumn or survive the winter. And studies show that leaving lights on all the time doesn't decrease crime. It actually gives burglars light to work by. So the best thing is to install motion sensors on residential outdoor lighting, so it's only used when necessary. And also using fixtures that are shielded and point light downward are better than those that scatter light everywhere. And also using warm amber LED bulbs rather than the blue-white kind will help because amber is less attractive to insects. Another good thing to do is to just close your curtains and blinds at night. Another goal ought to be to remove invasive plants. They are always a problem and a huge threat to biodiversity because they escape into natural areas and compete with native species, destroying habitat. Some can cause the collapse of local food webs that maintain ecosystems. They're everywhere, and I'm sure you've all seen them or have them. It's estimated that invasives could cover as much as 20% of the Earth's land surface by 2030. Most have characteristics like really fast growth rates or high seed production that allow them to move into a bare site quickly and aggressively. So, minimizing soil disturbance whenever possible, since that can expose seeds to light, and reintroducing native plants that are fairly assertive can sometimes help prevent reinvasion of what you've taken out. Also, minimize hardscape as much as possible, since it does really nothing positive for wildlife, and you'll have more room for plants. And last but not least, rethink things like using motorized lawn equipment, especially leaf blowers. Um, Rethink using synthetic fertilizers. Native plants that are adapted to an area usually don't need fertilizer, and some can even respond negatively to it, unlike most weeds that tend to love fertilizer. Um, and rethink using pesticides and poisons, which can have collateral damage on insects and birds that are much, much better at controlling unwanted bugs. And insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides can all drift beyond their intended target and kill indiscriminately. Um, Neonicotinoid insecticides are the most commonly used insecticides these days, and they've caused extensive ecosystem contamination. They've been found in fish, deer, bats, endangered amphibians, and birds, including seabirds and raptors. And neonicotinoids are one of the main reasons for the loss of billions of birds and bees. So I've talked about goals. Another thing I wanted to mention is that before you start choosing plants and to help make best use of your site, do some homework and get to know your yard, preferably over several seasons to see the changes. It's good to look at the inclinations of your site to see what's already there, figure out where native plants and communities of plants might want to go. And that can help narrow down plant choices that can sometimes be kind of overwhelming. Um, You'll also be able to figure out things like how to have pollinator habitat throughout the seasons. Planning also helps add signs of human intention, which can make a yard look a little less wild to neighbors, especially front yards. And if you just want to replace a few plants, you won't need to draw up a plan. But if you want to redo all or a big section of your yard, it's really helpful to do some bird's eye view bird's eye view plans on paper or computer that are drawn to scale. Here's an example. Plans are especially helpful for figuring out how to space plants appropriately. I'm not going to have time to go into detail on drawings, but there are some more samples in my book as well as other basic garden design books. A major thing you can do to make space for native plants is to minimize lawn, which is basically barren when it comes to biodiversity. Lawns today carpet over 42 million acres across the country, about the size of the entire state of Washington, and create homogenized landscapes that dramatically limit habitat. Lawns offer no shelter, no nesting habitat, and very little food for pollinators and other wildlife. Around 60% of the average yard in the US is lawn, and they typically receive more pesticides per acre than just about any other crop grown in this country. They also use massive amounts of water and synthetic fertilizers that kill soil life and get into groundwater and eventually waterways. And they're often kept neat with the use of fossil fuel powered mowers and whackers and blowers that create a lot of pollution that contributes to climate change. Native trees, shrubs, even smaller plants sequester much more carbon than lawn. And many of our native trees are especially long-lived, like oaks, maples, Douglas fir, pines, cedars, and they're very effective at storing carbon. Even untended lawns are really kind of a wasteland where native plants or edibles could be growing. And you don't have to remove all your lawn to introduce more diversity into your yard. Lawns can be good as pathways or play and workspaces, but if you have a lot of lawn that you're not using, think about reestablishing the habitat that the lawn had replaced. Replacing half the area that's now in barren lawn with native plants would create over 20 million acres of wildlife habitat in this country, and that's a huge conservation opportunity. If you're just starting out, you might consider removing just a part of the lawn so it doesn't feel so overwhelming. You can experiment with which areas you might want to convert by laying out a garden hose in gentle curves rather than straight lines, and then bring out your mower and test to make sure you can trim whatever's left. I recommend making beds as large as you can so there'll be lots of room for plants. If you have a parking strip, you could turn that into a mini garden, although they're not a great idea on really busy streets since butterflies and bees and birds can all get hit by cars. Um, Another great place for beds is wherever you want to create some privacy, and this is usually near the border of yards. Shrubs are much better than solid fencing if you want to help contribute to wildlife corridors. To get rid of lawn, the easiest and laziest way and the least damaging to the soil is to cut it short and then deprive it of light while allowing rain to reach the soil so that soil life doesn't die out. You can cover it with layers of overlapping biodegradable material like newspaper, about a half dozen sheets thick or so, or cardboard, not plastic, and then wet it down. And I like to poke a few holes in it to make sure it drains okay. And then top it with at least several inches of mulch. And I recommend a low nitrogen compost like leaf compost. And then you can top that with a layer of fallen leaves if it's the right time of year. Some people recommend wood chips, and that's okay if you're only going to be growing mostly trees and shrubs, but smaller plants like perennials and ground cover that spreads usually won't do well in thick layers of wood chips or bark mulch, which tends to compact and can prevent water from penetrating. You can cover lawn any time of the year. I like to do it in the spring because by fall it'll be decomposed enough to plant. A few options to replace lawn if you want to maintain some open space in a sunny area. Native meadow or prairie style gardens are great for pollinators that are out at different times of the year and that need large blocks of color and a variety of flower shapes and fragrances. Prairie or meadow gardens are sometimes drought tolerant, depending on the species chosen, and can be laid out as large borders or as more of a central focal point, wherever there's the most sun. It's best to make these as large as possible since native plants like goldenrod and yarrow, which you can see here, tend to spread quite a bit. I recommend at least 3 different species per season of bloom to provide a good variety from early spring till fall. Another alternative to lawn is adding native trees that can be underplanted with shrubs and other plants that would naturally grow with them. A landscape element that adds this type of structure and is great for wildlife is called a transition zone. In nature, it's where forest gradually meets grassland. In gardens, it extends from tall tree canopy to understory shrubs to lower shrubs to ground cover, creating a layered effect rather than just a single tree in the middle of lawn that doesn't provide any connections to other plants. It's always best to choose native plants when possible from the native plant community that had likely existed in your area had it not been disturbed. This isn't quite as important if you live in the middle of a city, but it's crucial if you live in the suburbs or a more rural area, and especially near natural areas. Right plant for the right place is one of the traditional maxims of gardening, but I would amend that to say right plant for the right ecosystem. Native plant communities are essentially loose associations of interdependent species that belong together because they adapted over thousands of years to have similar needs and tolerance for the soil type and topography, precipitation and humidity, sunlight, and wildlife of an area. Besides looking good together above ground, these associated plants often have symbiotic relationships where they help each other out, such as by sharing moisture and nutrients underground with the help of fungi and microbes in the soil. They also communicate with chemicals through the soil and above ground and interact through competition and other ecological relations. So when you grow them together and they're compatible with the conditions, you're growing part of an ancient community that helps maintain an ecosystem and healthy soil. One of the best ways to figure out what grew in your area historically is to look at nearby natural areas that have similar conditions that can be used as a reference site to see which species are there and how they're grouped and spaced. If you live in a rural area, sometimes you can actually find remnants of native plants in your yard or close by. You can also check with the Conservation District and also OregonFlora.org and the Native Plant Society of Oregon. And you can check to see if a plant is native to your county using the Biota of North America program or bonap.org, as well as the USDA plants database. There's also a website called databasin.org that shows native vegetation maps from around 1850 in the Willamette Valley. This slide shows the Valley of Marion County, and you can see how a lot of it was oak savanna, but also dry prairie and some forested and wetland areas. Obviously, if you live in the eastern part of the county, you'll want to choose from the Cascades, Western Hemlock, and Doug fir forest plant communities, which I'll talk about later. As with any plantings, it's best to choose plants that will thrive in the conditions you have instead of creating conditions to suit the plants, and group them according to their needs. Start by choosing trees if there's space, and then shrubs, and then the lower, smaller plants. Find out what shrubs mature widths will be and place them about that far apart or a little closer so there's a bit of overlap so that pruning won't be necessary. If you have the space, choose a variety of plants and place smaller plants fairly close together in masses or clumps to make it easy for pollinators to find them and for a natural look. And then repeat them if possible to create some continuity. Now, all that said, if your property has been so changed that the conditions can't possibly support the local plant community that existed historically, then you'll have to consider plants that can handle the current conditions or consider variations within communities and choose plants that will be compatible with each other. There are usually areas within yards that differ drastically from another area close by, like deep shade on the north side of a house, or a sunny patch, or an area that doesn't drain well. And these are called microclimates. But they can be a good thing because they help add diversity to even fairly small yards. These pictures show two areas about 30 feet apart in my backyard. One is almost in almost full shade, and the other one in more sun. So I was able to increase the diversity in a fairly small area. Also, try to use all the space you have. In nature, most of the ground is covered and protected by plants or dead wood and leaves and such. Ground cover plants that overlap and fill in empty spaces are really the best mulch. They're nature's way of inhibiting weeds, preventing erosion, and insulating the soil. And they also aerate the soil and provide habitat, especially when different species mingle together. And the same cannot be said for mulch like wood chips. There is one exception. It's important to leave some soil unmulched and not densely planted because butterflies need mud puddles, as I mentioned, and 70% of wild bees nest underground. So they need some soil that's not completely covered or very loose, like some mulches are. Okay, I'm going to switch gears and talk about plants. And please keep in mind that the ones I mentioned are just some of the plants that are in these communities. There are a lot more. So prior to European settlement, the area was a mosaic of grasslands, including prairie and savanna, forests, and various types of wetlands, most of which had a wide range of habitats with a really broad palette of plants. Unfortunately, a lot of them are now scarce or gone. I'll start with the Western hemlock forest communities and then the oak savanna and suggest some plants that are fairly easy to grow and fine for sale. If you have a yard that's already quite shaded or you live in a naturally forested area near the mountains, plants from the Western hemlock community should work well. Hemlock trees themselves need a lot of space, so they're not good for small yards. And they can handle sun to shade. They're a host plant for the pine white butterfly larva. Trees that grow with Western hemlock include Douglas fir on the left, which is also a host for pine white butterfly and some moths, and Western red cedar, which likes it fairly moist and does best with some shade. And it's a host plant for cedar hairstreak butterflies and some moths. Smaller trees and shrubs that live in the understory might be red alder and Pacific rhododendron. Red alder is an early succession deciduous tree that grows fast after a disturbance and controls erosion on slopes. It does spread quite a bit, so is best for larger sites. And it's a host plant for many moth species and several butterflies, including the western tiger swallowtail and the morning cloak butterfly. Our native rhododendron on the right attracts hummingbirds, bees, and butterflies. It's also a host plant for the brown elfin and gray hair streak butterflies. Ossoberry on the left is a large deciduous shrub that also spreads, but very slowly. It's one of the first plants to bloom in late winter, so it's really important for hummingbirds and early emerging bees. The fruit that ripens in late summer is good for birds and mammals. Mock orange is extremely fragrant and attractive to bees, pollinating flies, butterflies, and moths, and it's a larval host plant for several butterflies and moths. Another large deciduous shrub in the understory is red elderberry. In late spring, it has gorgeous cream-colored flowers that provide for butterflies, moths, bees, and hummingbirds. Leafcutter bees use the leaves for nesting material, and it's a host plant for the echo blue butterfly. And the brilliant berries that come late in summer are really great for a lot of birds and mammals. Vine maple on the right is a nice large shrub or small tree that's typically multi-trunked. It's great for smaller gardens, but is also really nice in larger spaces where several can be planted. It's long-lived, controls erosion on slopes. It's a host plant for the mourning cloak and tiger swallowtail butterflies, and provides nectar and pollen, and it does best with some shade. A smaller shrub is snowberry for part shade, which attracts small pollinators and leafcutter bees, and it's a host plant for the snowberry checker spot butterfly. Sword ferns are easy to grow, evergreen, extremely long-lived, and do well in shade to part shade. They're also a host plant for some butterflies. Salal, when it's grown in the right conditions, is a really handsome evergreen, fairly low shrub that can spread to as much as 8 feet wide. It's great for erosion control on slopes. It's a host plant for the brown elephant butterfly and provides nectar and pollen. Also provides year-round cover and is a really good substitute for English ivy. And orange honeysuckle is a vine that's wonderful weaving through open shrubs or small trees. It can get to about 20 feet long, so it's best, not best for small trellises. It's also a host plant for the snowberry checker spot butterfly. Some understory perennials include fairy bells on the left and ghostbeard. They're both obviously very graceful and elegant and provide for birds, butterflies, and syrphid flies. They like quite a bit of shade, and once established, they're fairly drought tolerant, although they definitely appreciate water when it's really hot. Also, fall Solomon seal on the left has showy, fragrant flowers and red berries in the fall that really brighten up woodland gardens. It has a cousin, starry fall Solomon seal, that's more of a ground cover, and it has smaller flowers and gets to about a foot tall. And both are pollinated by very small bees and flies and beetles. Tall bugbane on the right has really large leaves and these bottle brush-like flowers, and they're very attractive to pollinators and seed eaters. Unfortunately, tall bugbane is getting rare in the wild due to logging and fire suppression, invasive species, etc. And it's listed as a species of concern in Washington and Oregon. It also provides food for bees and flies and beetles. A couple of very stunning bulbs, and both of these like part sun, tiger lily or Columbia lily, which provides for hummingbirds, butterflies, and bees. And on the right, Oregon fawn lily, which is great for hummingbirds and bees. Some ground covers for shade include wild ginger on the left, which provides cover for insects and is pollinated by small flies. Bleeding heart is great for bees, bee flies, and it's a host plant for one butterfly species. And inside out flower, which provides flowers for bees, ants, and wasps. All of these spread by rhizomes to form a carpet under trees and shrubs. The bleeding heart is a bit more assertive than the other two, so might not be great for a really small yard. Also, woodland strawberry, which spreads by runners, and oxalis and stream violet, which like it moist, can spread by seed, but also rhizomes. Strawberry and violet are both host plants for several butterfly species and possibly some moths. And all three of them provide nectar for adult butterflies, bees, and hoverflies. So if you have some sunny areas that you want to keep open, you might want to consider the Oregon white oak communities. Today, less than 5% of native oak habitats remain, and less than 1% are protected. So it's one of the most endangered ecosystems in North America. Fortunately, Oregon white oak responds really well to restoration efforts, and the preservation of even just a few oaks can have amazing impacts. This oak is a host plant for several butterfly species, and it's just a really valuable habitat tree that can handle both dry, rocky conditions and seasonal wet soil, and even flooding. It has a little bit of shade tolerance, but can't compete when close to faster growing trees like Douglas fir or big leaf maple. Oaks are found in woodlands where they grow fairly close together, as well as in oak savannas, where they're much more scattered, only one or two trees per acre, where they get those really broad, massive crowns that you can see on the right. Um, they're not the best choice for small lots, since they can eventually grow to 50 feet wide, and their root zone can extend out twice that. So even though they're extremely slow growing, if you do grow them, be sure there's plenty of space both above and below ground. They're also fairly sensitive to soil compaction near their roots since they're quite shallow. Some oak-associated trees that do well on fairly moist sites include cascara on the left and ponderosa pine. Cascara is a small to medium tree that does best with some shade. The pine, which grows a lot bigger, can handle a lot of sun. Both are host plants for quite a few butterfly and moth species, especially the cascara. Um, Most ponderosa pine grow in rocky, sandy, or gravelly soils on the east side of the Cascades, but there's a Willamette Valley variety that once flourished in the valley, and I believe the district has it for sale. Prior to restoration efforts, it survived only in scattered areas between Hillsborough and Cottage Grove. If you have the space, they do really well at low elevations with heavy clay soil, and they grow up fairly fast. Shrubs that might grow with oak on fairly moist sites include willows, which like sun, and they support a huge number of insects and provide pollen for bees and food for many butterflies and moth larvae. So if you have a spot for them, they're a real asset. Pacific ninebark on the right is another large shrub that is usually found in moist places. It's great for large hedges or thickets, and its flowers attract butterflies, bees, and it's a host plant for the spring azure butterfly. Also, shrubs like black hawthorn and red twig dogwood, they both prefer sun to part shade and will eventually develop into thickets. Both are great for bees, butterflies, flies, and hummingbirds. Hawthorn is a host plant for the morning cloak and pale swallowtail butterflies, and dogwood is a host plant for the echo blue butterfly. Smaller plants that grow with the previous plants include Oregon iris and camas bulbs. These both need a fair amount of sun, and they're not super drought tolerant, and they're really great for bees and hummingbirds and butterflies. Also, Douglas spirea on the left, which is a host plant for at least 10 moth species and some beetles. It does spread, so it's probably not best for small gardens. Potentilla is a host plant for a couple of butterfly species, and checker mallow is host to at least 5. They all provide for butterflies, solitary bees, wasps, beetles, pollinating flies, and butterflies, and they all do well in sun to part sun. Western columbine is a magnet for hummingbirds, um, and bees and butterflies, and sphinx moths and lupins. And lupin really attract bumblebees and provide food for several butterfly species. Both of these do well in sun to part shade, but do best with some moisture in the summertime. Douglas aster and yellow monkey flower, both of these prefer sun. The aster blooms from late summer into fall, so it's really good for pollinators later in the season. Both of these are host plants for several butterfly species, and both spread very easily. The monkey flower does best in moist areas, such as near ponds or streams, or even in containers, and they're great for bumblebees. On drier sites, trees that grow with oaks include the lovely madrone, which needs extra sharp drainage, needs to be planted when very small, and once established, shouldn't be watered in the summer. It's a host plant for several moth and butterfly species, and its flowers also provide for bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. Shrubs for drier sites include serviceberry on the left, which has wonderful edible berries, and ocean spray. And both of these can handle sun to part shade, and they're both great for hummingbirds, a lot of different bees and butterflies, and they're both a host plant for at least 4 different species of butterflies. Plants like these with white or pale colored flowers and those that are scented are particularly good for moths. These plants actually evolve their nighttime perfume to attract moths for pollination. Red Fallen Currant on the left. And if you don't mind a thorny thicket, Nootka rose and bald-tip roses are gorgeous. The roses do spread though, so not best for really small gardens. The nectar of all these plants are great for bees and butterflies, and they serve as host plants for several butterflies and moths. Also, the leaves of the roses are used by leafcutter bees. Oregon grape on the left attracts hummingbirds, many kinds of bees and butterflies. It blooms best with some sun. Kinnikinick is a very low plant that spreads into a wide mat, and it's great on slopes that tend to erode, needs mostly sun. And both of these plants are larval host plants for several moth and butterfly species. Some smaller plants for drier sites include fescues, which are host plants for several butterfly species, and a lot of wildflowers, including Western yarrow, which is a host plant for painted lady butterflies and attracts a lot of bees, flies, and adult butterflies. Woolly sunflower on the left is a short-lived perennial that attracts native bees, beetles, flies, moths, and butterflies. It's also a larval host plant for various butterfly species. Pearly Everlasting on the right is a host plant for American lady and painted lady butterflies and is a really good nectar plant for butterflies and moths. Shooting Star is a small plant that self-sows politely. It's important for butterflies and solitary bees. And Goldenrod on the right is great for a lot of different bees, wasps, flies, and butterflies, and it's also a larval host plant. And Clarkia is an annual that attracts a very large diversity of bees, and it's a host plant for quite a few moths and butterflies. Nodding onion on the right is a bulb, which is a host for hair streak butterfly larvae and provides nectar for bees, hummingbirds, and some butterflies. So just a couple things, and then I'll let you go. Um, there's been a growing demand for native plants, which is great, but it's led to the breeding of native cultivars or nativars, which are cultivated varieties of natives that have been crossbred and or hybridized by plant breeders looking for certain characteristics like plant size or flower or leaf characteristics. And some of them do provide really well for wildlife, but studies show that many aren't as attractive and useful. Their pollen, nectar, or fruit may be deficient in nutrients, which is especially bad for migratory birds who need really high quality nutrients that provide lots of energy. And some nativars may actually lack nectar, or their flowers are so complex that pollinators can't even use them. A study on native cultivars back east and at OSU found that the more manipulated the cultivars became, the less attractive they were to pollinators. And since the interactions between insects and plants are so complex, and because we don't have an exact list of which are adequate and which aren't, it's really safest to stick with true native species. Also, cultivars of natives are propagated to minimize genetic diversity in favor of uniformity, so they should never be used in restoration projects where genetic variability allows plants to adapt. Also, try to buy natives that originally came from and evolved in your area or as close as possible. And the reason for this is that plants become adapted to their local environments by passing on genes that favor survival in that place. And over time, plants of the same species, but from different parts of their range, may develop different genetic makeups called genotypes, even if they look really similar. And mixing plants of different genotypes can cause problems by introducing less well-adapted genes into a population. So one way to avoid that is to buy what's known as a local genotype. This means using plants that were propagated from sources as close as possible to where you'll be planting. It also helps ensure that you get plants that will do well in your area because local genotypes tend to be more hardy and resistant to environmental changes like drought. And you can ask nurseries and growers whether they grow local genotypes.
Thank you so much, Eileen. That was a wonderful presentation, very thorough, and beautiful images too.
Thank you.
It looks like we just got a few questions in the chat here, so if you have a moment, I'd love to ask those to you.
Okay.
So for our first question, we have here, it was asked, what program do you use for designing, and what's the learning curve like for that?
Okay, I use Photoshop. There are some uh, programs that are specifically meant for landscape design. And I actually haven't ever used them since I use Photoshop. But I've heard that the ones that aren't very expensive aren't very good. And the ones that are more expensive are, well, I guess it depends if you would like to shell out a lot of money or, So I started out just doing them on, this is like 30 years ago, doing them on paper. And really, that's not a bad thing if you're just doing a fairly small section. But yeah, I use Photoshop. So if you have Photoshop, you could use that. Otherwise, there are other programs, but I'm sorry, I don't know their names.
Ooh, got another question here, and that is, what is the best resource for host plants, and what insect larvae they host?
Oh, that's a very good question.
If it does help, Eileen, I
Yeah.
did share a resource from the Xerces Society. I thought it
Oh, the
was
Xerces Society would be
very
be
thorough.
a good place to start. Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I was very impressed by your knowledge throughout the presentation of the exact species with the host plant too. That must have
Oh, thank
taken
you.
some
Yeah.
time to
Yeah, some of
define.
them I had to look up. Some of them are actually in my book. I have 100 plants at the second half of my book, or there's 100 plants, and I do put on each plant, I tell what the benefits are to wildlife, and I do list some of if there aren't a lot of them, I do list the species of the butterfly or moth, whatever. But yeah, but sometimes I have to look them up myself.
So for our next question here, it was asked, what conditions are best for growing salmonberry? She has gradually lost the entire plant in her yard over the last 5 years.
Okay, I know they don't like a lot of direct hot sun. Um, I personally never grown it myself. I do grow thimbleberry, and I believe they have somewhat similar needs. So I would say part sun, and a fair amount of water. It could be that during these hot summers we've been having, they've been a little drought stricken. Um, yeah, and they spread a lot. So, you need to provide space for them.
And then after that, it just looks like there's lots of good comments saying thank you for the presentation. And yeah, I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much, Eileen. That was wonderful.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
Yes, thank you, Eileen, and thank you everybody for joining us today for Eileen's presentation. We'll hope to see you all in February.